We're going over the Great Depression.
We will go over the topics economics, Hoover, how it affected African Americans, art and music, New Deal, and Roosevelt.
The Great Depression. What caused it? Did things cause it? Let's find out.
Ma tutti questi miliardi che si perdono in borsa, dove vanno a finire? Quale sono la parte? Beh, ma quando uno vince li prende i soldi. Allora dipende da chi perde. Non è così semplice. Ma quando uno perde, i soldi dove vanno?
To learn about the Depression, one must first have an understanding of the context and economics of the era. For that, we start 10 years earlier, the advent of World War I. It's easy to imagine the effects the war had on Europe's workforce and its industry. But we should also note that after the war, Germany was forced to pay so many reparations that it had to lend money from American banks. While Europe was still recovering from the war, America was actually experiencing an economic boom. Most importantly, this era saw the advent of credit, i.e. buy now, pay later, which was used to buy literally 75% of household items. This era was also marked by tariffs and isolationism. Of course, we all know how that ended up. Soon companies were producing way more than consumers were able to buy. Finally, on October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed, with 16 million shares being sold on one day. Millions of the shares ended up worthless, and those who bought theirs on margin were completely ruined. How to solve the Depression. 2 years after the beginning of the Depression, Americans elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His New Deal policies would in part lead to the Depression's end. Yes, the Soviet Union was one of the few countries not affected by the Great Depression, as its socialist economy isolated it from the rest of the world. In fact, nearly 40,000 people from the West actually immigrated to the Soviet Union because of this. However, in fairness, the Soviet Union was having its own economic troubles at the time, with famines going on in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. World War II arguably ended the Depression, Pearl Harbor basically ending America's isolationism. New jobs were created on the front and in factories, making the Depression more or less ended by 1945. The final thoughts. One of the most important effects of the Depression was the rise of Keynesian economics, which is the dominant economic philosophy in most of the West today. What we learned in the Depression is still relevant today, even if economists still debate what exactly that was to this day. Certainly, the first thing we think of is the 2008 housing crisis.
Let me put it this way. I'm standing in front of a burning house, and I'm offering you fire insurance on it.
How can these underlying bonds be as bad as you say? It wouldn't be legal.
Nobody knows what's in them. Nobody knows what's in the bonds.
And although there are many similarities there, lately economists have been wondering if we might not be headed to something even worse. They fear that Trump's tariffs echo those made right before the Depression.
And they can do whatever they'd like, but if they do that, then we put a big tax of 25% on their cars, and believe me, they won't be doing it very long.
Only time will tell.
Hello, and welcome back to the historical delicacies of the 1900s. Today we will be making Depression stew, a melting pot of the American economy's design. So let's jump right in. Now, set your oven to 800 degrees. It represents the 800 agricultural goods that had tariffs placed upon them that were exported to places like Germany and Britain. These tariffs were known as the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Oh no! That's actually pretty accurate. Ironically, the tariff was meant to cushion the economy after the crash. Just like marshmallows, which is our first ingredient. Our next ingredient is salt, much like everybody's opinion of Hoover back in the Great Depression. Hoover believed in local government. Because of this, he vetoed all bills that would have helped citizens affected by the Great Depression. And sugar is for the positive influences that Hoover had in the Great Depression.
There we go.
Next up, water. This represents Roosevelt and the New Deal, a refreshing addition that helped the economy flow back into place. And now dust, for the Dust Bowl, which helped further starve the children of America. The next ingredient is coins, which represents the money between the European countries and American banks. So next up, we have potatoes, which represent farmers. Farmers had it especially hard in the Great Depression. Now we put in some medicine, which they didn't have back in the Great Depression because there was no health care. Now that you're done mixing it, throw it into the oven. And when you're done, it's gonna look like this because nobody ate in the Great Depression.
Hi kids, welcome. I'm Amy, and today we will be talking about the Great Depression! And specifically, how it affected African Americans. White people were the first hired, last fired, and African Americans were first fired, last hired. This is called racial discrimination. It was done back then a lot to any race that wasn't white. In northern cities, people who were white without jobs was only 25% during the Depression, when African American unemployment was as high as 50 to 70%. Wow, that's a big difference. Back then, the color of your skin determined how you were treated. This is America. She represents America in the late 20s and 30s and its prejudices and discrimination. This is Jenny. She is white and works a high-paying job, but when the Depression struck, she lost her job. This is Susie, and she is purple, and she had a low-paying job even though she had the same level of education as Jenny. This is because she was judged based on the color of her skin, racial discrimination, which is wrong. Also, lost her job when the Depression hit. Because Jenny is white, she got Susie's job, leaving Susie without money to buy things like food and a house. Soup kitchens and charities largely excluded African Americans even though they were the most in need because they were the least employed and unable to buy food and housing. White people got the majority of the aid during the Great Depression. African Americans and other minorities began to vote democratically because their needs were starting to be ignored by Republicans. Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt became president. He gave African Americans and other minorities jobs by appointing many to his cabinet. Although the Civil Rights Movement didn't officially begin until 1951, organizations started in support and aid for minorities, specifically African Americans, such as the National Negro Congress, which fought for anti-lynching legislation, Social Security, and elimination of the poll tax, National Youth Administration, which allowed the continuation of African American youth's education, and Congress of Industrial Organization, which started African American labor unions. I hope you learned something about the Depression and how minorities were hugely affected. Till next time!
Food was a big part of the culture during the Great Depression. Home economists taught women how to get the most food out of the least amount of money. Things like casseroles, creamed chipped beef on either toast or waffles, and Chilean soup became popular. New foods came to rise, such as Spam, which I don't think most people eat that nowadays, as well as Toll House chocolate chip cookies, Kraft macaroni and cheese, Bisquick, aka instant pancakes, Krispy Kreme donuts, and Ritz crackers. Clothing also changed. One of the most popular characteristics of clothing during the 1930s was the illusion of large shoulders. People would wear clothing with either butterfly sleeves or banjo sleeves in order to enforce the illusions that their shoulders were bigger than they actually were. By the 1940s, most people were wearing shoulder pads beneath their clothing. During the Great Depression, a lot of people lost their houses because they weren't making enough money to pay their mortgage. When people lost their houses, they would become what we know homeless people. And these homeless people would build towns, and we would call these towns Hoovervilles, and they were basically shack towns full of really crappy houses, and that's where they all stayed. They were called Hoovervilles because they were named after the president, Herbert Hoover, who we had a very hostile opinion of during the Great Depression. Movies were also a very big part of the culture during the Great Depression. Gangster movies began to rise, as well as movies such as The Wizard of Oz, where certain characters could be taken out of their reality and put into a different one. After the rise of gangster movies began to fade away, what took over was cowboys and law enforcement. Law enforcement movies put people in government positions in a positive light, which was kind of helpful considering the hostility we had towards our president. Comedies were also on the rise as they assisted people in the distraction of what we would call now their miserable lives.
Good morning, everyone. Today's game is on the New Deal. Let's start with the contestants' names.
Arg! I'm Captain Frank. I own a glorious ship and I live on the sea with my 50 shipmates.
I'm Betty. I'm in a bike gang. I spend all my money on my bike and travel countries.
I'm Pete, and I own 6 cats.
All right, Frank, starting off with you.
$500.
First question. What was the New Deal?
The New Deal was a series of programs and legislation that were enacted in the attempt for economic relief.
Correct. Betty?
600.
Next question for $600. Who is the president that established these programs and legislation?
President Theodore Roosevelt.
Correct. Pete?
I'll go for 700.
Next question for $700. What were the 100 days?
The 100 days consisted of the first 3 months of Roosevelt's presidency, when much of the New Deal legislation and programs were established. I'm not cheating, you're cheating.
You're cheating.
Wow, correct. Captain?
500, second row.
Next question for $500. Why were some people against the New Deal?
Some people believed that the government was over-controlling the economy that were deemed unconstitutional.
Correct. Pete?
Second row, 600.
Next question for $600. What event ultimately ended the Great Depression and why?
The bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 led to the beginning of World War II. The war efforts stimulated American industry, therefore effectively ending the Great Depression.
Correct. Sorry guys, that's all the time we have for this week. Thanks for watching.
So those are the highlights of the Great Depression. You're welcome.